Hi everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Tech to Transform, the Mantis podcast. I'm once again delving into all things higher ed, but this time with a specific focus on technology. In this episode, I find out how edtech startups can help support a sector that's been so heavily impacted by the pandemic. I sat down with Jisc's Head of Higher Education and Student Experience, James Clay, who's worked in the education sector since the early 90s and has extensive experience in the use of technology to enhance and enrich learning. We discussed the impact COVID has had on our universities since March last year and how the sector has reacted to ever-evolving challenges since. We also talked about Jisc's relationship with edtech startups and how it believes both small and large companies offer enormous benefits to the education sector. James also offered his advice to those working in or in direct partnership with universities as we look ahead to a post-pandemic recovery. Take a listen. Okay, James, thank you so much for joining me today. Can we just start with you giving us a little introduction about your background and your role at Jisc?
Okay, well, I'm James Clay. I'm the Head of Higher Education, Teaching and Learning and Student Experience at Jisc. I'm one of 4 sector strategy heads that we have. And my role is kind of twofold, really. One is to ensure that Jisc is meeting the needs of our university members as in the fields of teaching and learning and the student experience. But likewise, working with our university members to find out what their needs are and combining that with business intelligence, sector intelligence, and also technological changes as well, because that has an influence on how those universities will be using digital and technology in the future. Just in terms of background, to be honest, I've been most things in education. I've been a teacher, I've been in charge of libraries, I've been an e-learning manager, I've been a senior manager, I've been an IT director, a CIO, and now I work at Jisc, where I've worked on various projects over the years.
Fantastic, thank you. So could we start really by discussing your experience, I suppose, at Jisc over the last 12 months? I mean, it's been quite a year for everybody, hasn't it? But particularly for the Edtech and the HE sectors. So could we just start there? You know, what's the impact been like for Jisc itself and for you over the last year?
Well, just as an organisation, it's always had some element of what we would call flexible and dynamic working. So people working at different locations, we have different offices. So for me, it was always fine to be able to either work from home, work in the office, work in a remote office, work in a coffee shop, to be honest. The reality of working at Jisc in the last 12 months is, of course, we've all been working from home. And that actually means we kind of been missing some of those aspects of travel, of meeting our kind of members, going out to universities and talking to them. Yes, we've had Zoom and we've had Teams and we've been able to do all that. So it's been hard, to be perfectly honest. I think it's a challenge to do that. And we were an organisation that understood how to use technology for communication and collaboration. I think the other aspect that's been hard for us is we'd go and visit our university members and our college members. We would go out, we would have meetings, and I think that interaction that you would have with people in that location certainly gave us a much greater understanding of their needs and their requirements. Obviously, the formalisation that a Zoom team brings to conversations means you miss some of that. So yeah, one of the things as the lockdown is easing, I think we're really all looking forward to being able to go back to our kind of members' campuses, meet people, and start having those conversations that we used to have.
It's a really collaborative sector, isn't it? You know, from my experience working with universities as well, you know, there's so many events, and although universities are separate organisations and effectively, I suppose, in competition with each other, it's very collaborative. People work together lots of the time, don't they? So being a part like this has, as you say, has had an impact on that, hasn't it?
Yeah, and of course, you know, the aspect, we still have conferences, we're still being online, we still have network meetings, community events and so on, but of course, what you don't get is that kind of in-person social interaction that happens just before the event starts. So have over a cup of coffee, you know, when it becomes, you know, you can have a virtual coffee break, but the reality is most people want to go and have a real cup of coffee and not just sit at the computer again. So yeah, I think that's something that's missed, and it's actually really, really hard to recreate online.
Yeah, absolutely. And what about the impact on the other side, you know, on students? We've heard lots about this and lots about challenges about the impact of teaching and learning moving remotely, and the student experience of, you know, students not being on campus. That's something that you've been kind of heavily involved in and very, you know, been tracking, I imagine?
Yes, I mean, last March we had that, the lockdown came in, universities had to switch, pivot, whatever word you want to use, to some form of remote delivery. And I think it's, there are various phrases bandied about. Obviously, digital and online enabled that remote delivery to happen, but it wasn't a planned approach to blended learning. It wasn't a planned approach to online distance learning. No, it was a quick kind of knee-jerk response. And we have to also remember is that at the same time that the students were being put into lockdown, so were the staff. And so there was real challenges as universities suddenly realised that they couldn't rely on their kind of existing IT provision and had to suddenly put, connections and hardware into both staff and students' homes. And also the kind of design of the curriculum, the design of the teaching was very much based on an in-person physical experience. And to be honest, most times that doesn't translate well to digital. You lose all those nuances of what makes in-person so good. And at the same time, just by merely translating, you lose all those affordances that digital can bring. So what we saw lectures becoming online Zoom calls. We saw seminars becoming team chats. Email was replacing that kind of in-person conversations that people would have in corridors. And the kind of end result of that was a level of dissatisfaction all across the board from both staff and students, but all of them recognising that we were in a global emergency and that this wasn't normal. However, one of the things that I would say is that over the last 12 months, certain things have been, universities and students have discovered some things have worked quite well under these kind of circumstances. And going forward, there will be some things that people will want to retain and to build upon. But at the same time, there are things they want to go back to as well. There's an aspect of what works well in person, what works well online, and thinking about how can we go forward and what does that mean.
Absolutely, it must be sort of the biggest edtech experiment for the sector, for the whole sector, really, hasn't it? It's, as you say, a bit of a knee-jerk reaction for many institutions, probably not for all, because they were all at kind of different levels on their edtech journey, I suppose. But it's certainly something that the sector has been kind of forced to try now, hasn't it? So I suppose within that time, especially in the early stages when it was, as you say, a reaction. I suppose a lot of the institutions would have looked to organisations like yourselves for support. So how have you been working with universities from those initial stages right until now?
Yeah, so we really stepped up our support for our university members. We provided advice and guidance. We built a community where people could share what was working, what wasn't working, share their practices, helping them to, get hold of the tools that they needed, helping them to get hold of the digital content, which was another aspect because the libraries were closed. And the other aspect that we started to do was think about what was happening, what did universities need to do for September 2020, but also building on that September 21 and beyond. And one aspect of that was a project we did called Learning and Teaching Reimagined, where we brought together senior people. We had a vice chancellors from a range of universities. We spoke to academics, we spoke to professors. We looked at what had been working, what hadn't been working, what lessons had been learned, and brought that together in a document that outlined kind of 7 challenges for the sectors to start thinking about going forward, and how Jisc could help and support them to do that.
Fantastic. And that must have kind of highlighted lots of trends. As you say, you were talking to universities all the way through. So you got lots of feedback, very aware of challenges, and there may be kind of challenges that were reflected across the board. But that also means that you can sort of monitor things that what's working for universities, what are not, that sort of thing. So what could we kind of just have a look at those for a moment? I think we're sort of aware of lots of things that perhaps were a bit of a challenge, but there must be things that have really taken technology forward in this time. So looking at the positives, I suppose, what were the kind of initial trends that you saw at universities, and I suppose that have been taken away through to now? Is there anything that kind of really stands out?
Yeah, there's a few things. I mean, we spoke to a major arts university, and as you might imagine, their students were desperate to get back into the dance studios, the performance spaces, the art places, and so on. But what they had found was the one-to-one tutorials had worked really well online. It was much more personable, it was much more intimate, and probably a good way of explaining this was very much about how what's the best way of describing this? It was more even. The technology made it more equitable, because both the academic and the student were both using the same tool. So it was less intimidating. And as a result, there was more open conversations, there was more open discussion. And that's something that's not just unique to that particular arts university. Other universities spoken to have had similar experiences. You know, I remember talking to one student who was talking about, you know, drop-ins used to be wait in the corridor, you know, and then go into the office. Now drop-ins were online, they could actually do other things. So the timing was much more productive and much more useful. The other aspect that has worked is, of course, been the recording of content, that students have been able to then go back and refer to it. And I think that has opportunities going forward about how do we create content that's not only accessible but also searchable, for example, and retrievable, because often what you want to do is you'd want to, you know, look at a lecture when it's live, maybe review it later, but when it then comes to your final assessment or you're doing your thesis or a project, you want to refer back to it. You won't want to watch that whole hour video again on the 2-hour video. You want to go back and find that particular section that was relevant to what you're trying to achieve. And I think that has implications going forward as well. So the recording of content, the access of content. Another bit that has worked really well is the kind of flexibility for both students and staff. I remember talking to one student who felt that her attainment and her achievement was going up, as well as her attendance. Bizarrely enough, she wasn't leaving the home, but because, you know, travel was a complex aspect for us. So it's actually been much more inclusive for some students as well. And we're also aware of some things about how digital can widen participation and be more inclusive than it has been before. You know, I will just say, contrary to that, there are been some challenges we've seen in the press with digital poverty. And there's two aspects to that. One was ensuring that students not just have the right hardware and the right connectivity to be able to access their learning, but also the space and the time. And that has implications for universities going forward, in the sense of how do we design a curriculum that may actually have to be low bandwidth, device independent, and can be done at a time and space and place that suits the student.
That's so interesting, particularly that first point you said about the student and the teacher using the same platform. I know from experience, you know, there has always traditionally been that, could we say, disconnect perhaps between the student and the teacher and the technology. You know, often it's about, we've kind of spoken about this narrative about teachers or lecturers, academics, kind of struggling to keep up with the digital natives, you know, the students. And this
I'm just going to stop you there. We have to be very, this is the biggest, you're not allowed to use the term digital natives because they don't exist. Right, so, you know, that actually is one of those disconnects that has actually happened in the sector. Was there have been some people who have, and some industries who think, okay, students really understand digital and therefore we're able to deal with this. The reality, unfortunately, is very different. We've actually seen examples where digital has increased isolation and loneliness amongst students, because then there was an assumption made that students would be able to form online communities easily because they were digital natives. The reality, unfortunately, is very different. We've done some research which has shown that where students had established groups and communities by in-person interaction, you know, they'd all been in the same tutor group, they'd all been to the same lecture, and they had established online communities, fine. But where you had first years come in, they were unable to do that. They were unable to form those online communities. So they do need, and the reason they weren't being facilitated was because people had made that assumption, was that because students know how to use digital technologies, it's something that, you know, I think is very clear. There's just because students can use digital, it doesn't mean that they know how to use digital to form learning communities, which is very different to maybe a social community or a family community and so on. So I think there's an aspect there that universities and edtech organisations need to be aware of, is never make this assumption that that technology, that students are technically savvy to be able to do things without some kind of support and training, and in some cases they almost need that in-person stuff. It's the aspect of well-being, the aspect of loneliness amongst students is a very, very real issue, and it's something that will need to be addressed going forward.
That's fantastic. So that's it's great to hear. You know, we do focus so much on things that might have gone wrong, or technology being a barrier, and but actually to have had kind of this situation really uncover those assumptions, I think is really important going forward, isn't it?
Yeah, no, very much so.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Okay, brilliant. So what sort of, after you've kind of uncovered those trends and you've been working kind of in partnership with those universities, I suppose, is that we're going to talk about kind of future thinking and future strategies and all that a little bit later. But I suppose that conversation has had to continue for you constantly, hasn't it, with universities and students, I suppose, just to, because the situation is developing and changing. Although, you know, we were in lockdown for a long time, we've all been working remotely for a long time now, things are actually changing all the time, aren't they? So I imagine trends are changing as well.
Very much so. I mean, you know, one of the things is, how do you create a course, for example, that's responsive to those changes? How do you design a curriculum that starts, you know, so come last September, most universities planned a kind of mixed blend of in-person teaching with online teaching. But of course, as we had a second lockdown, they had to change again. And then of course, with the third lockdown, they had to change again. And of course, in September, and you know, and I think everybody is really hoping that the use of the vaccine, the lockdowns has reduced the infection rates, but we don't know. New variants could create real challenges for the sector going forward. So being able to create a curriculum that's both responsive to changes in the landscape, but also creates real opportunities and transformation amongst that and learning experience for students, I think is really important. And that's something that we certainly have been working with the universities to start thinking about. So as I said, we did a program called Learning and Teaching Reimagined, and there were 7 sector challenges. I won't refer to them all, we can always put a link somewhere else. But one of the aspects was embrace blended learning at scale. And this is something about how do we do that? And that's kind of almost the next question. So one of the things that we have done at Jisc is we set out these challenges, we did the research, we spoke to the sector, and we came out with these challenges. The next stage is, how do we do this? What do we actually need to put in place? So we have created a new document called Powering UK Higher Education, which sets out kind of 4 priorities of, empowering culture and leadership. And then what we mean by that is, how do senior leaders and other managers within universities embed digital at the heart of their culture? It's easy to say, but actually it can be quite a challenge to do. And what does that look like? How do you avoid siloed working, for example? How do you ensure that digital changes don't have a negative impact somewhere else down the line? We want to kind of reimagine teaching, learning and assessment. And that's about not just about translating practice into digital formats, digitalization as sometimes it's referred to, but actually transforming that whole process of teaching, the whole process of learning and the whole process of assessment. And that means actually even sometimes taking a step back and thinking, what is assessment? One of the things that we have learned from the pandemic and the lockdown was universities have had a real chance to reflect and think about, actually, why are we assessing? What it is we're assessing and what outcomes are. And students are having to think differently as well. And that's created both opportunities, I think, for edtech companies, but also challenges as well, as universities completely start to redefine what they mean by teaching, learning and assessment. And there's also an aspect of the student experience as a whole, that from recruitment to kind of graduating, how can digital and technology improve that overall student experience? Reflecting that most students go to a university for a holistic experience, that whole thing. It's not just about getting the degree for them, it's about where you are, it's about societies, it's about building relationships, it's about growing as a person. And then the other aspect of there is kind of transforming the infrastructure. And what we mean by that very much is, you know, universities in the past were very campus located, which meant, you know, you just worried about the technology on that particular campus. But there's an aspect of going forward about extending the campus beyond. If students are now working and studying more flexibly, if staff want to work dynamically, how do we ensure that they're connected in a safe, secure manner? There's an aspect of the campus. You know, this is a conversation I often have with universities. Great, so a student has just attended an in-person seminar. Right, they now have an online lecture. Where do they go? Physically, where do those students go to attend that lecture? Where does the staff go to deliver that lecture? Does your estate, do your buildings, do your spaces allow that to happen? And there's an aspect of both connectivity, devices, and so on. And that's an aspect going forward that I think universities may need to consider is, actually, is our estate and campus fit for purpose for this new vision of blended learning going forward? So we at Jisc are very much here to help and support universities to do that. And we're going to do it in a range of different ways. We provide things like advice and guidance, so the universities can go to our website, see that aspects. We provide thought leadership, and we do that by sharing stories from our members, positioning ourselves as experts in particular areas. But likewise, we have a range of products and services, and also working with edtech startups and other companies, providing solutions to universities to meet those particular challenges. And then of course we can work very closely with individual universities as well to help them solve specific problems. How do we write a digital strategy, for example? How do we take our staff through the process of designing a digital curriculum?
Fantastic. I suppose to help deliver all of that and to see this kind of blended learning vision going forward, universities are going to need the help of technology providers and suppliers, most certainly. You know, it's a crucial partnership, isn't it? So if we were to think about that kind of edtech community, how does Jisc work with those smaller suppliers, and how do you sort of help support them kind of get their route into the sector, I suppose, and then kind of build those relationships?
Well, as well as the smaller suppliers, we do work with the bigger suppliers as well. And one way that we can do that is by brokering. You know, one of the things that we do at Jisc is broker deals with companies for the sector. So this means that, you know, creating frameworks as well and positioning that. What that does is it allows, you know, it allows the sector to get a better deal, because they get every member of the sector gets a single price rather than trying to negotiate individually, and it gets a discount for the entire sector. But of course that has advantages for the business as well, because then they have a way in to the entire sector rather than having to deal each time with individuals. But obviously one of the things that we did discover talking to smaller edtech companies, startups, people, SMEs and so on, was they found it really challenging to kind of access universities, because universities, to be honest, are mainly used to dealing with large companies because of the type of the procurement processes. So what we have done is been working with edtech startups, working with an organisation called Enrich, to help edtechs prepare to do business with universities. And likewise, we've been working with the universities, help them understand about how they can access those amazing products and services that these edtech companies are providing, that can be then used to, you know, enhance and enrich the entire student experience. So our EdTech kind of step up campaign has enabled companies to think about, what do we need to have in place? Who do we need to talk to? How can we ensure that we can meet the kind of procurement requirements of the universities? And likewise, universities have an understanding of what's out there and what's available. And so we've been working kind of with both sides in that case.
Brilliant. Is there anything those technology providers can do to work with you better? Do you need to see anything more from them, or is there, you know, I'm not talking about specific services or things like that, but are they sort of coming to you in the best position they could be in, or is there any further advice that would be?
I think very generally is, you know, edtech companies need to think about how their product fits into the digital ecosystem of a university. So universities are not things that work in isolation. So from a student perspective, you know, they will want to deal with almost kind of one experience. And that means there's opportunities for tech companies to think about, how does our product work with other products? How does our product work with the data collecting requirements for a university? And I think that's quite critical, is that, you know, the example I often use when I talk to universities, a student arrives on campus on day one and they know they've got a lecture. They want to know what it is, where it is, when it starts, what resources that go with it, and is there any extra materials that they need? You know, there's like 7 or 8 different kinds of questions. And the reality is from the university perspective, that means they need to access between 8 or 9 different systems. You know, if their course will be on the timetable, the location will be on a map finding software, the resources will be on the VLE, the extra resources will be in the library. And, you know, and from a student perspective, they don't understand why they will need to view 8 or 9 different kinds of apps. So there's an aspect of going forward about, you know, the best sort of technology is the one that becomes transparent. So from a student experience, it goes, what do I need? The interface, whatever it is, calls in the information and data from all the other systems, but presents a unified view to the student. And that sort of kind of global approach is much better from the student experience perspective. But the only way it will work is if those apps and services and devices all are able to work with each other. And so that's the one piece of advice I'd give any EdTech startup is not how good is your application or service, not what does it do, but how does it talk to everything else in the system?
Absolutely. I suppose as well, all those kind of themes and trends that we've discussed that you've discovered and uncovered while working in partnership with the universities through this time. I suppose it's crucial that those EdTech providers know all of this as well, isn't it? You know, it's no good them going into the sector if they don't know what the needs and requirements are today and in the future of those universities. But it's still incredibly difficult for those people to keep up with the kind of ever-changing environment, isn't it? So I suppose it's part of your role as well to make sure that make sure the information is certainly there for those suppliers, you know, to make sure that they are actually offering services that are needed now and are going to be sort of future-proofed, I suppose, or certainly, you know, are flexible, that they can cater to kind of different needs in the future. I suppose that's also kind of a big part of your role, isn't it?
I mean, our role is, you know, is with the Digital Agency for Higher Education in the UK. And to be honest, our priority is about satisfying our members, you know, satisfying universities, making them happy. However, all the stuff that we publish, all our guides and everything is freely available on our website. It's not something that we lock away and only allow members to use. No, it's so, you know, if EdTech companies are interested, they can go on our website. They can see the reports that we publish. They can see the advice that we're giving members and that sort of thing. So things like Learning and Teaching Reimagined, the reports from that are freely available on our website for people to be able to view, and that kind of gives them an insight. The other aspect that we do is when we do run kind of community events in particular areas, we will work with companies to come and talk about their particular products. In the past, for example, I used to run a project called the Intelligent Campus, and we were very interested in bringing companies who would work on smart buildings and smart, you know, Internet of Things and that kind of intelligent aspects, and bringing them together with the universities to kind of discuss various aspects of what was required. So we're very much about working in collaboration as much as, you know, our focus has to be our university members.
Brilliant. And restrictions are lifting all the time, as we know, which is great. And the government have given universities some guidance now, some sort of a calendar of and some advice on when to reopen. And so there is sort of a focus on the future now, finally, I think, rather than just the sort of getting through the day to day. And as we've said, you know, there's lots of things that we've all learned from the past year. But if we were to look at kind of universities and EdTech today and beyond, where do you think universities are sort of right now? Is the sector, it's, you know, we've talked about the challenges and the problems, and it's been a tough year for everybody, but would you say things are looking up and feeling a bit brighter, and people are feeling kind of optimistic for the new academic year and getting things put in place? Is it looking good?
I would say that from my experience of talking to universities, you know, that first 3 months of back in March 2020, you know, to be honest, you were just struggling to work out what you needed to do and what had to happen. You know, universities are in a much stronger position now, in a much more positive position. You know, their staff have got a lot of the technical skills required in order to utilize these different kinds of tools that they have and have ideas about what's worked and what hasn't worked. There are some still challenges going forward about how do you design, you know, a COVID-safe curriculum for 2021? What does that look like? How do you manage all those other kind of physical in-person aspects of the course, which are so critical? There are huge subject differences, for example, you know, so if you do marine sciences, for example, or forestry or something along those kind of lines, you want to be able to physically get out. And because it's outside, it's generally much safer. But what about lab work? What about working in hospitals and schools and so on? And universities have found that rather challenging. I think going forward, universities are in a position of we think we know what's going to happen, but we're not entirely sure. And then, of course, there is reliance on the international student market, and of course, that's a very different picture. The UK may have cracked the vaccine problem, but in other parts of the world, they're still struggling. And I think that's an aspect going forward, is that creates uncertainty. So going forward, I think that, there is no certainty. It is an uncertain future. But that means universities need to be responsive, they need to be flexible, and whatever tools and equipment and hardware and software that they need to use needs to be able to facilitate that responsiveness in these times of uncertainty.
Is that the advice that you would give going forward then? It's just nothing is going to be kind of set in stone, certainly for the foreseeable future. It's just about keeping on top of those developments, keep collaborating with each other as much as you can. Is that kind of the strategy?
Yeah, I mean, it's building in that responsiveness and flexibility. So are you able to switch? Are you able to pivot very quickly? And to work out what works well online, and to keep those kind of aspects still there. Making sure that you think about the overall student experience, and not just this one individual lesson or this one individual tool or this one individual experience. It's that holistic aspect which is so important, and that has implications from both not just the course and curriculum design, but the design of the whole student experience, where the student lives, where the student socializes, all those kinds of aspects. So making sure that you build on that. So there's an aspect of being prepared, planning, and I think one of the things that digital and online really does require is effective planning at all levels, but also thinking about what do we need to do to build in responsiveness? What do we need to build in flexibility? How does that ease and flex, if you think about it, so that if we need to change things, we can do it quickly and easily, and it doesn't have a negative impact on the student.
Fantastic. And James, I just have one more question. Could you just tell me what Jisc are going to be up to in the coming months to help to support universities in these sort of uncertain, as you say, and unpredictable months ahead? What's on the cards for you?
Well, we'll continue to provide a kind of range of publications in terms of reports, blog posts, news articles, advice and guidance. We will continue to support universities individually through kind of individual support. We will continue to have communities of practice. We have an event coming up called Connect More, in which cases we get practitioners and lecturers and academics from across the UK talking about their experiences and sharing those experiences. So we'll continue to do that. We'll continue to work with, on developing new products and services. We'll be working with kind of other companies as well to see what's new coming out, and whether there's opportunities there for universities to take advantage of those.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for telling me all of that, James. Good luck for the next few months. We'll be looking at the sector closely, and hope everything works out, and hopefully we'll have a few calmer months ahead.
Yes, very much so. Thank you.
Thank you.